Welcome back for another episode of AgriPlus News from the Field. This week it is minus 25 and a little miserable outside, so why don't we take the time to go over the last year for the 2022 growing season and see what some of the highlights and lowlights were and what we can maybe do to improve for next season. Winter conditions were overall somewhat average in the way that there's no such thing as an average winter in Alberta. We had fairly dry conditions through the winter, with a few snows in March giving us some additional surface moisture, which was very valuable at the time. Leading up to seeding, we did have daily highs in the 15 to 16 degree range, but we still had nighttime lows of -5 for quite some time. And those dry fall conditions that we had from the fall of 21 had some winter wheat on dryland in some very poor condition. Soil temperature managed to hit 5 degrees Celsius by late March, but it managed to stay in that range for quite a while due to cool nighttime temperatures, even though we had some pretty good daytime highs. While a few farms did start seeding in March, for the most part, most farms were not into the field until well into April. And another cold snap on the April 10th to 20th slowed germination of early seeded crops and frosted some barley that was starting to come out of the ground at the time. While early soil moisture was adequate due to those late March snows, it did quickly dry out, especially going into May as those daytime temperatures came up, and so did the wind. This frequently had drastic effect, sometimes from field to field, as soil conditions dried out and it became harder to get that depth and get that seed into that moisture. Seed that did not make it into the moisture sometimes sat there for 5 to 6 weeks until we got enough rain to get it germinated. And once again, those cool soil conditions and limited fall moisture prevented many of our weed species from emerging prior to seeding, which resulted in kind of limited weed control prior to seeding. Until finally on about May 19th, 10 to 15 millimeters or roughly half an inch of rain managed to fall in one good shower, and that really helped to get a lot of these crops out of the ground. Pretty soon, though, it became apparent that we weren't out of the woods yet as far as the canola goes, because flea beetles quickly made their presence known as soon as the canola got out of the ground. And due to poor soil conditions, canola struggled to get ahead of the flea beetles this year. Many fields ended up getting sprayed 3 to 4 times to control flea beetles until the plants were large enough to compensate. And normally, a 2 to 3 leaf canola plant can outgrow flea beetles, but the cold soil temperatures, the high winds, and the dry soil conditions kind of prevented canola from really effectively outgrowing the flea beetles, so many fields were still seeing very heavy feeding pressure and stunting up through 4-leaf conditions. And because of those dry seeding conditions with the canola, many fields had substantial difference in emergence timing across a field. In one case, I had a field seeded April 28th into dry soil, and that field still had canola emerging at the end of June, which is almost 7 weeks later. So when that happens, that causes a breakdown in the seed treatment effectiveness, and those plants can no longer effectively fight off flea beetles nearly as well. And a lot of those repeated hot and cold events, stressful germination and emergence, caused hormone issues that we will see later when the canola goes into flowering. Throughout May and June, nighttime temperatures stayed pretty cold. The last frost was on May 31st, but many nights got close right up until the end of June. Daily highs averaged in the low 20s during that time. In early June, we got some small rain showers, and that really helped to get the crop up and going, and was just barely enough to kind of spoon feed things along. Overall, in June, there was much less temperature stress from high temperatures than there was in 2021, where we had a solid week of 36, 38 degrees above early June. So that meant that this year our in-crop herbicides, especially on cereal crops, did work more effectively, did not cause quite as much stress to the crop. However, because we did have a lot of thin dryland crops with variable emergence, the crop did have a lot of trouble competing with weeds, and in many cases, after in-crop herbicide timing, new weeds that emerged were able to effectively compete with the crops. Also, in many cases, drought-tolerant weeds like kochia that emerged at seeding time were well ahead of the crop at herbicide timing. In the canola fields, cabbage seed pod weevil pressure was pretty spotty, but overall was lower than normal, and not a whole lot of fields had to be sprayed for weevils. As we hit July, we continued to get some small rain showers early in the month, which did keep things alive, but increasingly crops got stressed as the daytime temperature began to routinely get over 30 degrees Celsius. At the same time, nighttime lows in that single-digit range caused temperature stress to many crops, as during that 24-hour cycle things would heat and cool by over 20 degrees. Up until July, the cooler weather was quite a reduction in heat units compared to the 21 season, so corn was actually showing some developmental delays in many areas compared to the 21 season. On July 18th, we received 1 inch or more of rain in a thunderstorm event, which did unfortunately come down as hail over a fairly large corridor, the worst of which seemed to be kind of spread between Colehurst, North Lethbridge, Picture Butte area, and was so severe it wiped many crops, including corn, right off to the ground. Meanwhile, in other areas, grasshopper populations rapidly begin to explode with the heat in July. Grasshopper feeding quickly becomes an issue, especially on some of the winter wheat and other cereals that are already undergoing drought stress. Canola begins to flower mid-month, and it quickly becomes apparent that we have some pretty severe problems with flower blasting and oddly forming flower structures. The Canola Council and others quickly determined that it was caused by a hormone imbalance which was weather-induced from the poor growing conditions and the stress that we had earlier in the season on much of the dryland crops. And if that wasn't enough of an issue in the canola, quickly we developed problems with lygus as well as diamondback moth larvae, as the high temperatures allowed them to breed really quickly and feed on stressed canola. Numbers quickly went way over economic thresholds into the danger zone. As we moved into August, hot and dry conditions continued to be the norm, with no significant rain until we received more thunderstorms and hail on August 20th. Those hot conditions really favored lygus and diamondback moth larvae reproduction, and that caused huge explosions in the numbers and continued to cause problems until the pods started to toughen up towards the end of the month. Grasshoppers also continued feeding and causing damage on the crop for as long as it was green and palatable to them, and even long after that they were active pretty much right up till the end of October, laying eggs. Although the population of them did remain pretty high throughout the season, it did not seem like we developed the intense hot spots that we did in the 2021 season. Sawfly also made itself apparent as we got closer towards harvest and straw started to dry down a bit. Although it was present across a wide area, once again it was not nearly as severe as it was in the 21 season. That hot, dry weather throughout July and August did contribute to yield loss in a lot of the dryland crops, particularly in cereals where we did have thin kernels and low kernel weight. Canola did not develop and fill out to the size that it normally should, and neither did a lot of the pulses. And of course, right as we were beginning harvest at the end of August, we did receive another string of thunderstorms through the 21st to the 24th, and that did bring some pretty severe hail to many areas on some fairly mature crops, which did cause some pretty severe shelling and yield loss. Harvest itself was frequently interrupted by small rain showers and high winds throughout several weeks. Crop maturity was also a frequent issue with harvest due to the variable staging from spring emergence issues. A lot of thinner dryland fields also had problems with weeds remaining green at harvest. A lot of kochia, lamb's quarters, Russian thistle, weeds along that kind of line that were effectively competing with the crop stayed green well after the crop had matured. European corn borer also made a surprise appearance in quite a few areas and caused lodging and ear loss in some corn silage crops as they matured towards silage timing. During and after harvest, quite a lot of winter wheat was seeded this year. However, on dry land, a lot of the germination and emergence was quite sporadic from area to area because of dry soil conditions and overall poor weather. There was also an incredibly high level of volunteer barley, wheat, canola, etc., in the hailed out areas, which was increasingly difficult to control as we didn't get a killing frost until the end of October in most areas. In summary, overall 2022 was a better yielding year compared to 2021 for the most part in the dryland areas in my geography. Partially due to the localized storm patterns, however, moisture was very variable across that geography, and rainfall amounts pretty much averaged 7 to 11 inches between April and October. During that time period, huge daily temperature fluctuations did cause stress with the crops, as well as multiple heavy hail events which wiped out whole areas, and unfortunately that is somewhat normal in Alberta. The rainfall itself was mostly concentrated in only 4 major storm events, which dropped more than 10 millimeters of rain in the growing season. Otherwise, the vast majority of it came in small showers of less than 10 millimeters, which were largely inconsequential or too late in the season to help yield. Early season stress led to lower stand density, crop variability, and weed pressures that really made themselves apparent at harvest time. Grasshopper population also continued to build throughout the season, and egg laying continued well into October. I would expect the possibility of large hatches of grasshoppers for the 2023 season, depending on winter and spring weather. Winter weather will determine whether we get any significant insect die-offs or not, but even that is certainly not guaranteed. And a very high population of flea beetles was present in the fall, so that might be bad news for the spring. If they successfully overwinter, conditions in the spring might be pretty bad for flea beetles once again. So what does this teach us for use in the 2023 season? Well, I think definitely everybody should consider using more Lumiderm Fortenza style seed treatments on their canola for flea beetles. We do have the loss of some insecticide options such as Matador and Silencer for in-season control of flea beetles, Lygus, cabbage seed pod weevil. So that is going to put increasing pressure on remaining products such as FMC's Pounce. For those growing corn, they should also consider growing corn borer resistant varieties this year. It's not super common that we see corn borer in this area, but it was pretty bad in a few hot spots this year, and definitely using the proper variety is pretty cheap insurance as far as that goes. The 2022 season also really demonstrated the importance of seeding deeper into the moisture and not waiting and relying upon rain showers for germination. Cereal crops that were seeded deeper, 2 to 2.5, 3 inches in most cases, outperformed dryland crops that were seeded shallower at 3/4 to 1/2 inch. A lot of the shallower seeded crops came up in various stages over a matter of weeks, especially the canola. With canola, you are somewhat hampered at the depth that you can effectively seed to. Once you go much beyond 3/4 to 1 inch depth, you do start to suffer stand loss from increased seedling mortality. Also, for the 23 season, assume that all kochia you see in your field is group 2, 4, and 9 resistant or tolerant. That does not mean it is tolerant to all group 4s, for example. 2,4-D might still be a good tool on it, even though fluroxypyr might not. So keep that in mind. I saw more glyphosate resistant kochia in canola this year than I ever have before. It is definitely on the rise in our area. And along with that, we did have a long open fall with some periodic rain showers, and that means we are likely to have weedy fields in the spring. We did have a pretty good emergence of fall annuals in October through November, so I would expect to see them in the fields this spring.